First of all, a big thank you to Jan for inviting me to this conference and for arranging it, because he is such a leader in Norway of this kind of movement. So I'm delighted to have this opportunity to be with you today. I'm standing here so I can see what's happening as well. It's going to be about what low carb, high fat, how needed it is in the UK, because of course we've been doing the low fat, high carb, and it's been a complete and utter disaster. Now, some of you may know Twiggy, a model from the 1960s, absolutely beautiful. She's still beautiful today. She has got a bit more meat on the bones, you'd be pleased to know, but she was just naturally of that weight in the 1960s. So that was what the UK was known for. This is now what the UK is known for. Now, this is from my own country. This is Wales. This is Georgia Davis, and she has the distinction of being the fattest teenager in the UK. And those are her weight measurements. So you can see at 10, she was already 1.5 times my weight. You can see at 15, 210 kilos. You can then see what happened between 15 and 16, because she went to a boot camp in America and she lost almost half her weight. But as everybody knows who tries a calorie deficit diet, it goes back on and then a bit more. Or in Georgia's case, it doubled and then it doubled again. And this photo was taken by one of the national newspapers when the front of her house had to be taken down with a bulldozer so that they could get this 19-year-old girl to hospital. That's what low-fat, high-carb has done for the UK. So the agenda that we've got today, this is what we're going to be talking about. The obesity epidemic is the overriding theme that I want to tackle. It's a constant fascination to me. We want to be slim more than we want anything else in the world, and yet 2/3 of us are overweight. It doesn't make sense. Hopefully it might make a little bit more sense to other people if they watch this presentation. To you guys, I think it makes a lot of sense already. That's why you're here. We'll go through why did we change our dietary advice, the case against fat, and hopefully this is going to give you some great ammunition to go back to the people who are criticising the way that you're living. What did we change our advice to? Were we right to change? What should we be eating? Which again, we know the answers to, but I hope to give you some good insights into that. And the obstacles to change, because as Anna said in the introduction, there are obstacles in every country, but there seem to be even more in the UK, or particularly in Wales. People are not ready for this just yet. Now, all of the references at the bottom of the slide we've put on my website. There's a card that's going to be available by the coffee later on, just so that you've got a copy of that web address. All you need to do at the end of my website is stick in Oslo. There's a hidden page, it's going to have all the references on it. The presentation will go on there. The link over to the live feed will go on there. So you don't have to worry about noting all the references or understanding what they are. They're all on there. Right, let's get cracking. This is the obesity epidemic in the UK. Now, the data comes from the World Health Organization. They started monitoring the UK back in 1966. I've extrapolated it back. You can extrapolate it back 8 million years if you want. Depends how far you want to go. We didn't have an obesity problem in the UK, let alone an epidemic. We first developed even a measure of obesity at around 1.8% in the 1960s, 1972, 2.7%, and then look what happened. In not even 3 decades, obesity in the UK increased about tenfold, 2.7 to 25.8. I'll take that as almost tenfold. It's just incredible. I mean, we look at that now, we're almost immune to it, but it is just absolutely incredible what we have done to a human population in the blink of an eye in terms of evolution. This is the US data. So you can see again, there's something very interesting that happened around the late 70s, and then to me that's something taken off. That looks pretty much like the aeroplane I took off in yesterday. It goes up at 45 degrees. Something happened around the late 1970s. And of course what happened was that we introduced dietary goals for the United States, and very shortly followed the dietary guidelines for Americans. So it was the Senate committee, Senator McGovern, 1977, who first came out with the guidelines. They've then been institutionalized in America. So they come out in 1980, 85, 1995, every 5 years. These things come out and they don't change. They still say the same advice. And then the UK followed. So in about 1983, we had a nutritional committee that basically took the advice of the Americans. We'll come to that advice in a second. And then that was embedded in the UK in 1984, and you can see the connection with heart disease, cardiovascular disease starting to emerge. Now, when I say we changed our diet advice, it'd be much fairer to say we did a U-turn in our dietary advice. We were going in one direction and we just completely turned around. And this is what we changed from and to. So, great quote, and I have Gary Tobes to thank for finding this quote from Tanner's Practice of Medicine, which was deemed the medical Bible for English-speaking doctors from 1869. Farinaceous and vegetable foods are fattening, and saccharine matters especially so. Flour, sugar, and interestingly, vegetables, starch. That's essentially starch and sugar, that's what Tanner was saying. And this is what we put in one document in the UK. You'll be able to read all of these slides at leisure later on. That paragraph basically says, we used to think that carbohydrates made us fat. We don't think that anymore. We now think that fat is the problem. And therefore you must reduce your fat intake. And of course we know the minute you reduce fat intake, carbohydrate intake has to increase. We didn't tell people to eat more carbs. We didn't tell people to base their meals on carbohydrates because we knew that carbohydrates were healthy, were going to be good for anything. Weight, diabetes, heart disease, cancer. We didn't know any of that. We just decided that fat was bad. So we need to now look at why we decided that fat was bad. Now I'm going to whiz through this. There's some great presentations on this on the internet. You'll be familiar, no doubt, with this chap here, Ansel Keys. These are bunny rabbits, and of course this is all about heart disease. So Ansel Keys, he was the man of the moment. For those of you who know about obesity studies, he'd done the Minnesota starvation experiment in the late 1940s and published it in 1950. It was a brilliant experiment. He was the man of the moment and he wanted to stay that way. So heart disease at the time could be positioned in two ways, and we still do this today, okay? So the actual heart disease for Americans at the time in 1960, when he was trying to start all of this, was 1.45%. So 145 people in 100,000 were dying from heart disease. But of 10 people who died, 4 of them were dying from heart disease, okay? So you've got two different numbers there. You've got people dying in total, which is actually very, very small. You know, you won't know more than a couple of people who die each year unless you've got a lot of friends in their later years. And yet it was the 40%. It's 4 in 10 who die of heart disease. Yeah, but if nobody dies, who cares about the 4 in 10? Do you get how they positioned it to make it so much more serious than it was? So he spent the 1950s, he remembered these experiments that the Russian pathologists had been doing at the turn of the previous century, the 20th century. And they'd found that when they were pathologists, when they opened up these bunny rabbits and they'd fed them cholesterol and eggs and foods with cholesterol in and so on, they had some sort of clogging going on in the arteries. They hadn't actually died of heart disease. You probably don't know that bit. They hadn't actually died of heart disease, but they noticed the clogging. So there was just this connection made between cholesterol and clogging in the arteries. Now we know now that when arteries are damaged by sugar or smoking or stress, the lining of the artery needs healing. So cholesterol and lipoproteins, carrying all the good things that they do, go to the scene of the damage to fix that damage. That's why cholesterol is found there. It didn't cause the crime. It's like the firemen turning up to put out the fire. They didn't make the fire. They turned up to put it out. You know, that's how wrong we've got cholesterol. Completely 100% wrong. So anyway, he had this association between the cholesterol, the bunny rabbits. Nobody thought to point out at the time that actually rabbits are herbivores. And the only foods that contain cholesterol are animal foods. You do not get cholesterol in things that vegans eat, as they will proudly tell you. But the bunny rabbits were therefore fed things that would clog them up. They could not metabolize. But that's how this whole thing started. So Keys then spent the 1950s trying to find out, does dietary cholesterol raise blood cholesterol? And he concluded, and you'll want a reference to this one, because even Ufi Ravenscoff last week was saying, I didn't know he'd actually said it that clearly. Oh yeah, he really did say it very, very clearly. Cholesterol in food has no significant effect on either cholesterol in the blood or the development of atherosclerosis in man. Now, this is where my logic then went to. Only animal foods contain cholesterol, okay? Meat, fish, eggs, dairy, only foods that contain cholesterol. So to establish that fact at the top, he fed a lot of humans a lot of animal foods and concluded they had no impact on blood cholesterol levels whatsoever. So unless I'm missing something, if the animal foods containing fat had no impact, then animal foods themselves have no impact. Not only did you let dietary cholesterol off the hook, you let the animal foods that you fed the human subjects off the hook. But nobody made that connection at the time. So we carried on as if fat were the problem. The obvious macronutrient for Keyes to have studied at this point was, of course, carbohydrate. Because he'd given those people the meat, the eggs, the fish, basically fat protein, but he didn't make that connection. So he went on to do the 7-country study, 13,000 men, 7 countries, 16 cohorts, and these are the 3 verbatim conclusions. Again, you've got the ref, it's the final volume of 20 of the 1970 publication. I'll just put them all up. Coronary heart disease tends to be related to cholesterol, cholesterol tends to be related to saturated fat, and they all tend to be related to each other. Well, of course, if A is related to B and B is related to C, then A, B, and C are going to be related, but that's all that he managed to establish, was just an association. Now, I can find an association between people in this room and people in Oslo. It doesn't mean that everybody in Oslo thinks low carb, high fat. You know, it is that tenuous. So he only quantified by how much he thought he had the evidence for cholesterol and saturated fat and heart disease. In a paper that was published 25 years after the 7-country study, all the references there, and he found that, for those of you who know statistics, the correlation coefficient, Pearson, the standard way of measuring correlation, he said if I had known the cholesterol levels of the subjects of the 7-country study at the beginning, then I would have been able to establish a 0.72 relationship at 25 years with those who then went on to die of heart disease. So if he could have plotted that, the line would have had a 0.72 gradient. For those of you, the strength of the relationship is then 0.52, the R squared. Well, that explains as much as it doesn't, or it doesn't explain as much as it does. It's 50-50. When I was looking at his original figures, because I'm doing a PhD in this area at the moment, I happened to notice that there was a far more striking correlation between the latitude of the cohort, where the cohort actually was, and those who went on to develop heart disease. So, for example, the Finnish cohorts were the furthest north, the Mediterranean Japanese cohorts were the ones closer to the equator. So I reran the correlation. There's a 0.96 correlation for coronary heart disease deaths and latitude. When you do that as the R squared, you've still explained virtually everything. So he didn't need to do a 14-year study with 13,000 people with all those blood tests and all those doctors. He just needed to ask them their postcode at the beginning, and he could have predicted with virtual certainty who would have died of heart disease over the next 25 years. Now, does that make sense? Well, of course it does. Because cholesterol is synthesized into vitamin D when there is sunshine. The further away from the equator you are, the less sunshine. So the people in Finland have higher cholesterol levels because they have less sunshine. But the thing that is likely to kill them, may I suggest, is the lack of vitamin D, not the fact that their cholesterol is high. The fact that their cholesterol is high is just a marker. It was trying to tell us something. There's a New Zealand guy called Robert Scragg, I think that's in one of the references just as an add-on. He established this in terms of heart disease, vitamin D. Keyes could have beaten him to it if only he hadn't been so convinced that fat and cholesterol were problems rather than cholesterol being a marker. Okay, so you're going to be able to see all of these slides later, so don't worry too much. This is going to the heart of the studying that I'm doing at the moment. This is the paper in submission, if I get the right title. Evidence from randomized controlled trials does not support the introduction of dietary fat guidelines. It just does not support. So what I've done with some colleagues at University of West of Scotland is look at the randomized controlled trials that were available at the time we changed dietary advice. I don't want to study from last year, trying to post-rationalise it. I want to know what was the evidence for changing our advice. And there were 6 randomized control trials. Some of you will be very familiar with those, the Dayton LA Veterinary study, the low fat study. Some of you will know those. But here's the interesting things to note about this slide. Okay, only men were involved. The S in this column means secondary. So with only one exception, there were some primary subjects in the Dayton study. That means they hadn't already had a heart attack. In every other circumstance, they were studying men who had already had a heart attack. And you've got from 2 years to 5 years, and you've got the dietary intervention here. So you've got 2,500 people that were studied. That was the totality of the randomized controlled trial evidence available at the time we changed dietary advice. So for the conclusions, remember the advice that was introduced was twofold. 1, no more than 30% of your diet in the form of total fat, and 2, no more than 10% of the diet in the form of saturated fat. Well, if you flick back and look in that right-hand column for the dietary interventions, try and find something that tested either of those 2 recommendations. The one that gets closest to it is the Woodhill study. And Woodhill tested 10% saturated fat, but unfortunately the deaths in the intervention, the death rate was 18% versus a death rate of 12% in the control group. Oops, as Dr. Malcolm Kendrick would say, we managed to kill off a few more people there in the wrong arm, but that was the only study that even tested one of those 2 recommendations, and it was done in 1978, so it was after America had already changed its dietary advice. So there were 370 deaths in total in the intervention groups. That's about a 30% death rate, which is phenomenally high, but that's because they're dealing with sick men already. The 370 in the intervention groups. Anyone like to guess how many there were in the control groups? 370. Absolutely no difference whatsoever. Now, if that had been, there was also no significant difference whatsoever in the coronary heart disease deaths, because sometimes we see the figures played with of, oh, we did this intervention and lots of, more people died in the control group of coronary heart disease. And people like Ufi Ramskov are then very quick to point out, yeah, but look at overall mortality. You can only die of one thing. If the people on the intervention with the vegetable oils were dying more of cancer, you haven't actually made a good intervention. But there was no difference. There was no difference in deaths. There were no difference in coronary heart disease deaths. So we changed dietary advice for 276 million people, having studied 2,500 sick men, and without even the 2,500 sick men providing the evidence. Now, if that evidence had been the most overwhelming evidence you had ever seen in your entire life, it would still be a bit of a stretch to take it from 2,500 sick men to nearly 300 million people, but we managed to do it. As an aside, and you'll hopefully be able to see the paper in publication at some point, there were reductions in cholesterol in all groups. Probably because at the time they were admitted to the study, having just had a heart attack, their cholesterol was probably quite high, because their body would be making a lot of cholesterol to repair the fact that they just had a heart attack. So hopefully, as they survived the heart attack, the cholesterol did its job, they got a bit healthier. The ones that died, we don't know what their cholesterol was, but it had nothing to do with it anyway. So, bottom line, there is no evidence for the dietary guidelines that are strangling every country from Australia to Canada. A few interesting things here. I will keep an eye on the time, actually. This is known to the authorities, but it's not generally known to the public. So that 1984 report from the UK, the one that embedded the UK dietary advice, this is a statement from that report. The ideal trial has not been done and probably will not be done. Because they recognise that actually you can't do the perfect intervention, but they kind of gave up when the interventions didn't show what they wanted them to show. So they know it hasn't been done. Trustwell, which is a paper heavily relied upon in the UK, found exactly the same thing. The perfect trial hasn't been done and probably never will be done. And I wrote to the Food Standards Agency in the UK in 2009 and said, look, why do you still demonise fat? Why are you still going up these crazy fat guidelines? Where is your evidence? And they replied to me, do you know what, the study probably isn't going to be done and it hasn't been done. So this is public information coming from governments And we get the grief that we get from dietitians and those public health advisors. I'm hoping to give you some ammunition today to start turning the tables a little bit, because they don't have very much. So this is what the UK is eating. We're into a new section now. This is what the UK is eating. They call it the Eat Well plate. I call it the Eat Badly plate. I've seen somebody call it the Eat Hell plate. This is UK role model healthy eating. And it doesn't take you long to find the cornflakes, the white bread, the bagels, the sugary nuggets. We'll come to this soon. We've got fruit juice, you know, sugary stuff in there. We've got sugary baked beans. And then you come to this magnificent section where you have a can of cola, you have Battenberg cake, sponge cake, biscuits, cocoa. Now, this is supposed to be by volume, by weight, by the picture on your plate. So of course what happens, because of the calorie density of some of those things, this, which is supposed to be a third, ends up about 6% of your calorie intake, because that's probably an average of 50 calories per 100 grams. This is probably an average of 600 to 800 calories per 100 grams. So this ends up, and I've done the maths, this ends up at over 20% of your calorie intake. So what is the UK eating? Oh, this, by the way, ends up at about 50%. We're eating the things that Tanner said used to make us fat. Vegetables, floury stuff, starchy stuff, sweet stuff. Here's the other ironic thing. I mean, why can't they see how crazy this is? This, okay, is essentially glucose. This has got glucose in it, but it's essentially fructose. And of course, what is sucrose, but one molecule of glucose and one molecule of fructose. So at the same time as telling us to eat less sugar, they're telling us to eat sugar. They don't seem to have made the connection that every carbohydrate either is or breaks down into sugar. It's just sugar. And they say have no more than 5% of your total intake as sugar. But you've just given us a plate that I can only spot a couple of things. I don't know if you can spot them there. You've got an oil, you've got a bit of fish, and you've got a bit of meat. I mean, there's some breaded stuff in there as well. But I think those are probably the only 3 products on the whole plate that would not have an impact on blood glucose levels. And then we wonder why we have coronary heart disease and diabetes, which is now 4 million people in the UK. Cancer, do you remember Otto Warburg? But for cancer, there is one prime cause, the oxidization of sugar in the body. He said that back in the 1960s, at the time that John Yudkin knew what we should have known today. And that's the state that the UK is in at the moment. Now, we have fantastic data, which I love playing with because I love numbers. And this is from the National Food Survey, and the National Food Survey confirms pretty much what that plate says. We are eating over 1,500 processed food calories on a daily basis. In any one week, the average Brit is having 1.4 kilograms of flour, 730 grams of sugar, and about 40 grams of butter. And we still have dietitians saying it's butter that makes you fat. I mean, you've got to laugh really, haven't you? Because I don't think it's the butter when I look at the 2.1 kilos of the white stuff. Now, what has gone down in the time that the obesity epidemic has gone up tenfold? Well, red meat, eggs, we eat half the number of eggs we used to, 1/5 of the butter, 1/5 of the whole milk. What's gone up? Ice cream, threefold. Processed potatoes and vegetables, you know, people thinking they're getting those healthy foods, but actually it's oven chips or it's some corn in bread or whatever. That's gone up 3 times. Soft drinks have gone up 6 times. And yet still they will say, to manage the obesity epidemic, we must avoid red meat and eggs and butter and whole meat. All the things that we haven't been eating during the time that we had an obesity epidemic. Guys, it just isn't adding up. Now, this is some other original data that I've done. I was inspired by something that Dr. Malcolm Kendrick had done on saturated fat using the Monica study, and we'll come on to that data in a second, but I wanted to do something for cholesterol. So we had a 7-country study that said there's an association. A few years ago, I think it was 2010, Saturday afternoon, I found the World Health Organization data for mean cholesterol levels and death rates from cardiovascular disease for all 192 countries in the world. So I plotted it, and I did not expect to find that. I honestly did not. I thought there would be either a scatter plot or maybe an upwards trend. I didn't expect to see a slight downwards trend. Now, it's not big. The R line is 0.018. This is for men, and it's for cardiovascular disease deaths. I've put on the UK and Norway in red just for your interest. And you just see a very slight downwards trend. The higher your cholesterol, the lower your death rate. Okay? So now we look at women. Same thing, cardiovascular disease, mean cholesterol levels. There's Norway. You're right out here, guys. You've got great cholesterol levels and pretty good heart disease. They're the UK, lower cholesterol, and pretty similar on the heart disease rates. But I mean, look at that trend line. That's much more clearly a downwards trend. That's cardiovascular disease. So this is men, all deaths. And you're now getting a much stronger R and a much stronger R squared. Strength of the relationship and the line that you've got going on there. You really don't want to be having low cholesterol when you look at that chart. And then you do it for women, and it was just very handy that they got steeper and steeper as I went through the 4 variations that I wanted to go through. For women and high cholesterol, low death rates, you've got an R of 0.73, which if you remember is better than Key's got with the whole thing that got us into this mess in the first place. I've had people in our online club take those charts into their doctors. Ufi has presented them at conferences, and people say, well, they must be wrong, because their mindset is just cholesterol causes heart disease. It isn't even associated with heart disease. And if there is no association, there is no cause. You have to have association first. You haven't even got association. I'm not going to stand up here and say high cholesterol causes lower heart disease, but I'm tempted, because the evidence might well be there. Now we turn to fat. So Malcolm did it for the Monica study. He took the 7 highest countries, and he found that they had that 7 with the highest fat intake had the lowest death rates. So again, I just thought, well, I'll plot it. I'll plot it for all the European data that's available. That's 44 countries. We're down this end of the chart again, pretty good on the death rate and pretty high on our saturated fat intake. So this is as a percentage of energy. Now, that's where we're supposed to be. We're all supposed to be this side of the line. Well, I don't want to be that side of the line, because their death rates up there are way bigger than our death rates down here. And that's for men and saturated fat, and of course it gets steeper still for women and saturated fat, because, I don't know, here's a hypothesis, even more than men, women need fat and good nutrition, because we are the ones that bear the next generation. Maybe it is, but it's having more of an impact on women anyway. You know, so women, even more care, do not go for a low-fat diet. So we're now on to what should we eat? Given that there was no evidence for any of that, if we were starting with a clean sheet right now, what would we be trying to eat? And the first principle for me is real food. So people say, you know, what are you? What do you see yourself as? I see myself as a real foodie. First and foremost, I want people eating real food. I want the processed food companies to go out of business, because nobody is eating that junk anymore. So just come with us on the real food, because even vegetarians can come with us on the real food. They can come with the brown rice and the fruit and porridge oats, stay off the wheat because it's not good for anyone, but they can come a long way. Just make the first step real food. So there's no debate at that level. The only nutritional debate that the planet should ever have is plants or animals. And the way I would like to approach that is to show how you don't make the choice up front. The choice is going to get made for you as we go through the nutritional analysis. Some people will say, well, what level of carb intake shall I have? Look, unless you're a diabetic or you know you're so carb sensitive you've got to limit to, say, fewer than 20 grams or 30 grams or 40 grams, unless you're in that category, don't worry about your carb intake. Just come with me on this very short little journey and the answer will pop out. So we start with macronutrients. Some of you may be very familiar with this. Some of you, there might be a couple of penny drop moments here, because I've run this by so many doctors and people in Thinks and other nutritionists, and some of the basics aren't necessarily absolutely ingrained. So there are 3 macronutrients: carbs, protein and fat. We know that bit. We put them in blue, yellow and red, because we're going to start mixing up those primary colours at the moment. There is only one substance on the planet, I'm not going to call it a food, that is 100% carb, and that is sucrose. There's only one substance or one food group on the planet that is 100% fat, and that is oils. Sucrose and oils, they have no water, no protein, they don't mix in any other way, they're pure foods. They're really rare. There is no pure protein food. Some people try to get close to it by having things like egg white omelettes, white fish, skinless chicken breasts. That's not natural. That's not how food comes in nature. So to all intents and purposes, I'm going to assume there's no pure protein foods. You don't want to be going that route. So nature then tends to put foods into either a carb protein category or a fat protein category. And the carb proteins are plants. To all intents and purposes, the fat proteins are animals. So this is what the vegans don't eat. This is what the vegans do eat. Now, you've got over here the fruit and veg. As you get closer to the centre, you're getting more into the brown. For those of you who know your colours, brown is what you get when you mix blue, yellow and red. It's when you've got all three macronutrients in there. So nuts, seeds, avocados tend to have all three macronutrients in good measure. You've got here grains, beans, pulses. They are very much carb proteins, but they do have a trace of fat. In fact, some of you may even have seen a teeny trace of fat in things like blueberries. But by and large, those are your carb proteins. Over here, you've got fat proteins. Meat and fish, entirely fat protein. Apart from the glycogen in liver, there's no carbohydrate in meat and fish. Eggs have got a trace, you can virtually ignore it. And dairy, of course, start to have a carbohydrate content. As a rule of thumb, about 5% carbohydrate content. So that is food. So the only debate that there should be is, are we on the plant side or are we on the animal side? And another thing that I don't think is widely enough known is that anything that does contain fat, which is this whole group and anything in this brown group, and of course those traces there, any food that contains fat contains all three fats: saturated, monounsaturated and polyunsaturated. There are no exceptions. Now, we've got dietitians running around in the UK who think that animal foods equal saturated fat and plant foods equal unsaturated fat. It's so wrong. It's so wrong. So here's 3 oils, and it just proves the point. I can pick any foods, and we will on the next chart. So we have here saturated fat. This is corn, so that's predominantly polyunsaturated as a fat. The olive is predominantly monounsaturated, and the coconut is predominantly saturated. But they all have all 3 fats. Come back to me after this presentation, find me a food on this planet that does not contain all 3 fats if it contains one of them. There isn't one. So they've all got all 3 fats. So this chart, and you'll be able to see this, I see some of you taking pictures with your phones, which is brilliant. I absolutely love this chart. If you want to take one chart to bang a friend over the head with, this is the one. So we've got the macronutrients. We've got water, just to show where there is a water content. We've got carbohydrate, protein and fat as the 3 macronutrients. And then we've got the 3 fats separated out. Now this is in order of going up in fat. So sucrose, no fat. Oils, 100% fat. Lard, 100% fat. Butter has a water content and some protein, so it's not a 100% fat. And you can see how you start moving up here. Now here's the interesting thing, and here's another principle to take away. You've got there is no food without all the 3 fats if it has one of them. Here's the second one to take on board. The only food group on the planet with more saturated than unsaturated fat is dairy products. Meat has more unsaturated than saturated. Fish, more unsaturated. Lard, oh I love this one, lard, got to find lard. More unsaturated. It's only 39% saturated. The majority is unsaturated. Not that saturated fat is bad, it's not, it's marvellous. If you have to pick one, it's probably the best of the 3. But just to set the record straight, when people are telling you not to have red meat and all the rest of it, they don't know this. This is the one slide to put in your handbag or whatever. And here's great fun. So we're told to eat oily fish, but we're told to avoid red meat in the name of fat. Well, mackerel has got twice the overall fat and 1.5 times the saturated fat of sirloin steak per 100 grams. These are the factoids to have to hand when a dietitian is telling your loved ones, oh, you need to eat oily fish but never touch red meat again. Even by your own rules, which I don't agree with, even if I did care about fat or saturated fat, you're still talking nonsense. That's the only thing that you can conclude from that. Now, here's how you make a decision as to what to eat. You go to the micronutrients. Because if we don't have 13 vitamins, and it's approximately 16 minerals that we might want to worry about, if you don't have those, you're in bad trouble. You don't have vitamin A, you're going to lose your eyesight before long. Don't have B12, you're going to go pretty mentally unwell in a very short period of time, a couple of weeks. It's probably how long it takes a vegan without a B12 injection. So that is just the nutritional content for a select basket of food. You can go on the Nutrition Data website yourself and do the same thing for any foods that you choose. But it's why I am frequently quoted as saying the single best food on the planet is liver. Okay, there might be another offal product, but it's an offal product. Then you've got steak, very, very useful for getting things like zinc, but just a fantastic all-rounder for the B vitamins. Sardines, oily fish is absolutely essential for the vitamin D, calcium, phosphorus, the bone nutrients as we call them. Yeah, broccoli's, dark green leafy veg, don't knock, it's paleo, don't knock the green stuff. They do bring some really good things to the table, particularly vitamin C. But here's a very little known fact, that's the vitamin C content of an apple, that's the vitamin C content of liver. So the people saying, oh, you have to eat carbohydrates to get vitamin C, no you don't, veal thymus, other glands will happily give you vitamin C. How did we survive the Ice Age 10,000 years ago, which lasted for 30,000 years, if we couldn't get everything we needed from the animals that were running around? And we've got the plant stuff up here. I've put in red so you can see it easily, the one that wins for that line. So you've got the gist already, I'm sure. So brown rice wins on calories, hurrah, but that's probably not the one they want to win on. You've got lentils here. And they win on one of the B vitamins, but then again, look at the calorie content. This is all by 100 grams. If you wanted liver to go into a competition with lentils, just go in on a calorie per calorie basis and it's there. And then calorie per calorie, you've got to divide all of those by 3 and all of those by 3 to compete with the liver and the eggs. So the plant foods just can't compete. That's on vitamins. Go over to minerals. Now I've dropped apples here because apples are just useless. I'm sorry, but there's 5 a day. Just look at the nutritional content of apples, carrots, peas, whatever, versus liver, sardines, sunflower seeds, eggs. It just can't compete. So I swapped out apples and put in one of my favourite substances, which is cocoa powder. Comes in nice bars of high quality dark chocolate, and then this absolutely cleans up for your minerals. Now, okay, if we hadn't put the cocoa powder in, some of the plant products would have done okay on minerals. Well, that's only to be expected, they come from the ground. But if you're looking at your vitamins and your minerals together, you're going to have to come back to this side of the table. Try to get the micronutrients and you will end up eating meat, fish, eggs, and dairy products. So back to the how do we make a choice as to what we're going to eat? Real foods, not a question. Plants or animals. Michael Pollan, remember famously said, eat food, mostly plants, not too much, and I would say eat food, mostly animals, quite a lot. Because the other thing to bear in mind, again, go back to that table, you've got to eat quite a lot to get what you need on a daily basis. You probably would need a good 250 gram steak to be getting your zinc intake. If you're a vegetarian, I found this out the hard way, you need 39 eggs a day to get your vitamin D requirement. 39 eggs a day. Or about 200 grams of oily fish, ideally in a tin where it's got the bones and the skin and all the good stuff still crunched in. So that then leads this group to the whole grains, the beans, the pulses, the fruit, the stuff that we are told is good for us. And this leads us to the pasture-fed meat, eggs and dairy, for those that have the dairy. Fish, fruit in season. I'm not against fruit at all. What I'm against is overweight people in Wales eating pineapple on Christmas Day, when pineapple is not indigenous to Wales on any day of the year. And if you've ever had, I had some grapes recently. I just happened to be sat next to some grapes at someone's house and I found myself mindlessly eating them. It was like toffee. I mean, the sugar hit, incredible. We do agree on vegetables and salads. For the people who are so carb sensitive, they've got to limit it to 20 grams of carbohydrates a day. I admire you, I salute you. I'm really, really lucky that right now I'm not one of you. If I get that way, I know what I have to do. But most of us can enjoy vegetable salads freely. Low carb, high fat then becomes an outcome. It's not that you have to make a choice, I'm going to be low fat, high carb. Sorry, low carb, high fat. It is just the outcome of choosing the most optimally nutritious foods. So again, when people are saying to you, you've got to have low fat, high carb, start asking them, where am I going to get my zinc? Where am I going to get my B12, my retinol? Whatever you want to ask them. And if they dare say that cereals are fortified, you absolutely have my permission to smack them around the face. I think Malcolm Kendrick says actually that's when you slap them around the face with a wet kipper. I think that's probably a better one. Yeah. I'm sorry, but putting iron and vitamin D in sugary, floury cereal does not make it food. That's one of the things that most annoys me. Obstacles to change. Number one, government dietitians. Now, why this should be so difficult, I don't know. Here's a fabulous quote from Alexander Pope. For somebody to admit that they were wrong is just to say that I know more today than I knew yesterday. How is that so hard? And yet it is. We know, we've been there. It's like we're challenging people's religion, their belief system, their whole entity. And in some ways we are. We're challenging what they learned for 3 years at dietitian school or for 6 years at medical school. We're challenging the whole principles of their job. But they have to be open to challenge. If we spend the rest of our lives, us included in this room, thinking that everything we know now is never going to change, we may as well call it a day now, because that's not what being human is about. It's about being curious. It's about the journey. The economic factors are immense. If I were the government in the UK, I would not be having conversations about how do we get out better dietary advice. I'd be having conversations about how do we cope with the 60% of people who are not working where they should be working, which is on the land. How do we cope with the fact that all the employees at McDonald's, Starbucks, Coca-Cola, United Biscuits, Nabisco, whatever, General Mills, Kellogg's, all of those employees need to go out of business because humans should not be consuming that stuff. That's the debate that they need to be having, but they're not having it. Those are the economic factors. And then, of course, we've got the conflicts of interest. PepsiCo, worth $66.5 billion. If you put PepsiCo on the list of countries in the world by GDP, it's bigger than 65% of them. It's the size of Sudan. And that's what you're up against when you're trying to say to people, stop having that junk. In the UK, we have something called the responsibility deal. My side of the team calls it the irresponsibility deal, because it's the government trying to work with fake food companies to solve the obesity epidemic. So the chocolate manufacturers make a slightly smaller bar of sugar and vegetable oils and just frankly junk, and then charge you the same price for it. And that's a win for them, and they think somehow that's going to do something for the obesity epidemic. I mean, it's just nonsense. As someone, Simon Capewell, I think it was, in the UK said, you know, trying to work with the food guys on obesity is like putting Dracula in charge of the blood bank. You know, it's just not going to work. So how embedded is this problem? Well, America, these are the sponsors of the American Dietetic Association. You'll be able to see people on Twitter pointing this out. Andy Bellarti is a great, rare dietitian over there, actually prepared to stand up and say, no, this is not what I trained to be a dietitian for. There's your PepsiCo there. The US is even more frightening. There's a blog on my website on it. If you just put in American dietitians, you'll find it. This is actually legislated in the US. So I don't know if any of you know. There's an organization called a credentialing organization. They have legislated that in the US, the only people who are allowed to give nutritional advice in 47 out of 50 states in America are registered dietitians. This conference would be illegal. These conversations would not be allowed to be disseminated. We must not in any way be seen to be giving nutritional advice because it is a monopoly. And then who is behind the American Dietitian Association? This bunch. So this bunch have effectively monopolised the giving out of messages to the American public about diet. And this is not alone. I don't know how many other countries I put up. This is the British Nutrition Foundation. I almost struggled to get them all on. I think I took off my usual Australia slide and I put on one I found from a Nordic conference of dietitians. Quite recently, the dietitians from Scandinavia all get together and make sure they've got Flora and Unilever and that kind of junk nonsense, Kellogg's, Nestle, working with them because, you know, Scandinavian people are entitled to have the messages that these companies want to give them. So, we're so nearly there because we're all jolly hungry, no doubt. Here's a quick summary of what we've just gone through. We changed our dietary advice at about 1983-84. We changed with no evidence whatsoever. John Briff, I was, just tiny digression, I was speaking at a conference last year for the Institute of Optimum Nutrition with John Briffer, and he had the most amazing arguing stance that I've ever seen. We've got to stop defending ourselves and we've got to start attacking back. So now that you know there's no evidence whatsoever, it is not for you to defend your low carb, high fat lifestyle. It is for the other person to provide the evidence. So put them on the spot, because you know now that there isn't some. So you know when it happened, the dietitian won't. So ask the dietitian, so when did we change our dietary advice? What exactly did we change it to? And what was the evidence at the time that we changed it to? There's been no evidence since, by the way. I'm not being disingenuous here, that we didn't come out with a ton of evidence in the 1990s. There has been no evidence since. We know the study has not been done. But just throw it back to them and say, why do you say saturated fat is so bad? Why do you say red meat is going to kill me? And then see what they come back. Oh, everybody knows, it'll raise your cholesterol. How biochemically, metabolically can any animal food raise your cholesterol? And by the way, did you know it was proven in the 1950s that it doesn't? You've got the ammunition now. Don't defend, guys. We've got to stop defending. It's very tiring. Start attacking. We changed to the wrong advice. We changed to low fat, high carb. And obesity increased, certainly in the UK, almost tenfold in that period. Throw it out. Coincidence or cause? I know what I think. I know what probably the people in this room will think. But why, again, can't public health advisors, dietitians look at that aeroplane taking off on those first two slides and not realise that there's a connection, should we say causation? If you eat for nutrients, then low carb, high fat is the only outcome. If you ever have a choice to make, I cannot think of a plant food that is going to be an... And it also addresses obesity, type 2 diabetes, cancer, coronary heart disease, because remember that eat badly plate slide, they're all associated with those conditions because the common substance is sugar. This is the final slide. I heard this at a Barry Groves presentation, rest in peace. I spoke at his funeral last year, was obviously very sad but very honoured to do so. And he points out that we are the only chronically sick animal on the planet. They're not queuing up for the doctor in the jungle or going to have bariatric surgery. It's only animals that come into contact with man that have this problem. So I wondered, could this be why? Well, man is the only species clever enough to make his own food, but he's also the only species stupid enough to eat it. Thank you very much.